Welcome, all my brothers and sisters in Adam, to my sermon on the forced evolutionary virus. I am Rad King, and it is long past due that I give the forced evolutionary virus, or FEV, its dues. From the very first game, FEV has been heavily talked about or featured, and its heavy influence on the Wasteland is undeniable, as it has given us some of the most iconic Fallout characters and enemies. This will be an in-depth look at the virus, going over its history in the game, the lore about the nature and characteristics of the virus, and lastly, lore problems, inconsistencies, and speculation on my part at the very end. So turn up the rads and don't get mad as we methodically explore the complex world of FEV. I have a special announcement at the end, as well as my comment highlights, where I go over the best comments from my last video, so make sure to stick around all the way to the end, lest Adam smite thee. Let's go. To really understand FEV, we need to know its origin and history and see how the virus came to be what it is in the Fallout games. In that endeavor, I think it is best to talk about events chronologically, starting with the earliest events. FEV gets its start with the pre-war disease known as the New Plague. That was a virulent and deadly disease that was affecting people in the US since the early 2050s. Among the efforts to find a cure for the New Plague was research being done at the West Tech facility in what was then California, with the aid of a supercomputer ZAX 1.2. Beginning in earnest in 2055, these research efforts did not yield anything of much use, as the New Plague continued to sweep across the US, still infecting people all the way up until the Great War in 2077. The New Plague and potential biological threats from China forced the United States government to institute the Pan-Virion Immunity Project in 2073, so it only took them 20 years to start to get serious. In 2075, researchers believed that the only way to, and this is a direct quote, combat newly made biological weapons was to alter uninfected DNA so that it was no longer susceptible to standard viral infection. Although ZAX explicitly states to the Vault Dweller in dialogue that FEV came about as the result of searching for a new plague cure, that last quote, that is recovered from a holodisk from the West Tech facility, makes it seem like research into preventing all potential viral diseases led to the theory behind FEV. And to be honest, that seems like a pretty noble venture, finding a panacea that will protect people from all viral infections. Sounds pretty great, doesn't it? The earliest form of FEV was known as Batch 10-011 Pan-Immunity Virion, after which it was officially renamed to the Forced Evolutionary Virus. Tests in 2075 on flatworms showed increased body mass and resistance to almost 40 different viral contagions, and these effects were seen to be passed on to progeny, although researchers noted only asexual reproduction took place. So it looks like early efforts against viral infection were actually pretty promising. Experiments later that year on mice and rabbits noted increased strength, speed, intelligence, and brain growth in the areas that affect emotion, behavior, and memory, with a notable increase in aggression. Albino mole rats were experimented on, and 2 of them escaped, to be seen much later in the Wasteland. Experiments continued to be conducted on more complex organisms, including raccoons, dogs, and lastly chimpanzees, where similar results were found as before, with increases in strength, intelligence, and aggression. 2 pairs of raccoons escaped and were to be the genesis of the cut faction of sapient raccoons known as the Slanter. After the tests on chimpanzees, the US military decides that it is interested in these results and forcibly takes control of the program and subsequent research, constructing the Mariposa military base in record time and moving research there from West Tech in 2076. Although the latest pre-war version of the FEV is not named, it could realistically be referred to as FEV-1, since in 2077, FEV reaches near completion with a rather high success rate, and it is this new, more successful version of FEV, which is called in-game FEV-2, that the Mariposa military base vats are filled with. Military volunteers are tested on with pretty horrific results, which, when discovered by the army personnel guarding the facility, gave rise to the Brotherhood of Steel. In the time between 2076 and the eruption of the Great War, a deal was struck with the dying town of Huntersville in West Virginia. Facing a dwindling population and no discernible way to restart the local economy, the US government stepped in and offered them a grant wherein the government would supply new sewers and a water recycling system, and a new West Tech facility was constructed near the town. Sounds like a pretty good deal, but knowing what we do about the US government in Fallout, we just know this won't end well, but the townspeople were happy to have a town on the mend. Initially, the facility was built, and researchers were told that they would be working on genetically modified crops in order to create better food. Nothing that wholesome could ever truly happen in Fallout though, and before they even started their work, their directive was changed to do research on FEV. This research was split into two groups: an advanced mutation lab that would try and create new strains, and a virology lab that would test the effects of a pre-approved strain in low doses on the town in Huntersville. Once the project began, people started falling ill, and no one other than the researchers knew why. It did not take long before the townspeople appealed to the West Tech scientists for any assistance in identifying the spreading illness. They were assured that it was an uncommon strain of flu, holding to this lie even as people's skin started to turn green and their hair started falling out. Things would get progressively worse, with people's bodies beginning to mutate hideously, and the 12th Mountain Regiment was even called in to keep the townspeople, now turned test subjects, from escaping. Fighting broke out after not too long, where the mutated townspeople showed heightened aggression towards the soldiers guarding the town, escalating tensions to fever pitch. While Huntersville was going to hell in a handbasket, experiments continued on the Advanced Mutations Lab, most of which were unsuccessful. Recombining FEV strains resulted in test subjects that couldn't even live for 15 minutes, and one specimen was dosed with contaminated FEV that inadvertently replaced most of its tissue with retinal tissue. Over time, test subjects would live longer and longer until in October, the team finally created a biologically stable creature. This twisted and horrific looking creature was planned to be released in Huntersville, but this would never happen due to the Great War. This creature would take things into its own hands and eventually break containment not too long after the Great War, and would go on to create a whole new menace in Appalachia known as the Snallygaster. Another success for researchers came on the eve of the Great War, where the Snallygaster strain of FEV successfully created a huge hulking monster that broke containment. After the creature was successfully sedated, it was in the process of being transported when the Great War broke out, causing the truck to crash and the creature to escape, where it has been able to multiply in Appalachia, being dubbed the Grafton Monster. Such was the state of FEV mutation and research and the state of Huntersville and its hapless populace by the times the bomb dropped, turning a horrific state of affairs into a hopeless one. In 2071, Vault 87 was finished and fitted with a number of advanced technologies, including a cyberbrain computer system, a Garden of Eden creation kit or GECK, stasis chambers, and a plasma containment field, among many other things. Whatever the experiment originally was, it was changed to study the effects of FEV, and from all records, this research did not start in earnest until after the vault was sealed and the world above bathed in the fire of Adam. Likewise, the Enclave is never said to have had FEV in their possession prior to the Great War, but given their influence and power pre-war, I believe it is only a matter of time before we find some group of the Enclave in a yet unexplored part of the United States that has FEV and has experimented with it. But at this point in time, all their known experimentation has occurred post-war. The Institute also had no FEV in the pre-war, and didn't have any for over a century, where one of the directors came into possession of some in 2178. So, at the time the bombs fell, there was FEV at the West Tech facility in Appalachia, the West Tech facility in California, and the Mariposa military base also in California. At an unknown point in time, an unknown group related to the US military started a project to create a terrible creature whose purpose was to be used in war against the enemies of the United States, using the fan favorite FEV to accomplish this. It resulted in the creation of Wanamingos, which are mostly isolated to the Redding area of post-war Nevada. Not happy with just one nightmare weapon of war, the United States military also funded projects to create shock troops from the humble Jackson Chameleon, which, according to the Fallout Bible, also used FEV in the creation process, resulting in the cute and cuddly Deathclaw. The more things change, the more they stay the same, and the pre-war fascination with FEV grew into something that no one could have imagined. The earliest known group to start working with and experimenting with FEV in the post-war was in Vault 87, as research and testing began almost immediately after the bombs fell, starting what was to be called the Evolutionary Experimental Program. With the intent to create super soldiers, the program used an alternate form of FEV that was distinct from any other strain. Pulling from the local residents of the vault, these ill-fated folks would have fared better outside the vault than in it, because many of these experiments used novel strains of FEV that produced hideously mutated monstrosities. Many of these test subjects would not live long, as the mutations were too extreme for the body to continue functioning. One of the stable strains was unique from any other strain in that it caused the subjects to turn a yellow-green color. All strains of FEV lead to massive muscle growth, and this strain is no different. However, there are vanishingly few intelligent mutants from the Vault 87 strain, with Fox and Uncle Leo being some of the few we know about that can communicate easily and form bonds with humans through friendship and compassion. Sexual dimorphism is absent with the Vault 87 strain, and apparently all primary and secondary sex characteristics are lost after infection. Another important difference between super mutants from the Vault 87 strain is that a select few super mutants will go on to become super mutant behemoths, one of the largest wasteland creatures on the East Coast. It didn't take long for the Vault's inadequate security protocols to allow the Vault to be overrun, as these test subjects would take control of the Vault, escape, and go on to be known as the Capital Wasteland Super Mutants. The mutants would go on to use Vault 87 as the place to take Wastelanders to be infected with FEV and become a new generation of super mutants. Over in what used to be West Virginia, the Appalachian Enclave were swift to recover after the devastation of the Great War, and were keen to ensure that China met its end due to the devastation wrought on their American homeland. That is some serious follow-through. This pursuit was a single-minded goal by none other than Thomas Eckert, the so-called president of the Appalachian Enclave. In order to launch what was left of the Appalachian nuclear arsenal, automated systems in the region had to detect a threat great enough to warrant a nuclear response. The Enclave sought to create this false threat by utilizing the FEV research in the West Tech facility, pumping out super mutants with the stable strain West Tech was using to experiment on in Huntersville. They pushed forward with these plans in 2084 and also began their own homegrown FEV research, creating new strains and experimenting on a host of creatures. One of these experiments included exposing irradiated bats to FEV that resulted in the creation of one of the fiercest wasteland creatures yet, the Scorch Beasts. Flooding Appalachia with super mutants and eventually releasing Scorch Beasts ensured Appalachia was once again consumed in violence, this time brought to you by your friendly neighborhood FEV. By the time Fallout 76 takes place 25 years after the Great War, super mutants continue to roam and pillage. Snallygasters and Grafton monsters continued to terrorize, and the Scorch Beasts finished off anyone who survived the bombs. As destructive as the Scorch Beasts were, the plague known as the Scorched Plague was the real death knell. And although the plague was some sort of fungus-like disease and not a variant of FEV, FEV was directly involved in the biochemical treatments that brought the Scorch Beasts and subsequently the Scorched Plague into being. All this happened in the first 25 years after the Great War, and didn't last much longer, as the player in Fallout 76 ends the Scorched Beast and Scorched Plague threat. In 2102, when Richard Gray happened upon a random military base in California and fell into one of the FEV vats, starting his transformation into the Master, he was one of the first on the West Coast to experience firsthand the capabilities of FEV. The virus, known as FEV2, greatly expanded Richard's mental faculties, and this led to a fascination with the virus and many more experiments. Richard's body had undergone widespread mutation and caused him no longer to be recognizable as his former self, or even human for that matter. But that did not stop him. His experiments involved fusing animals of different species together to observe the results and capabilities of FEV, and even direct injections into his body that led him to successfully mutate to interface with the facility's computers and access all the pre-war research data. Using this data and his own experience with the virus, he began to capture or lure humans to the facility where he would then expose them to the virus. These initial experiments were not successful, and it wasn't until the next year that Richard determined that radiation exposure in specimens would have an effect on FEV's effectiveness. Knowing this, he successfully created the first of many super mutants, assimilating some of them into himself, creating what he would refer to as the Unity, and building a small force of super mutants, amongst whom was his loyal and intelligent first-in-command, the Lieutenant. Along with super mutants came the creation of centaurs and floaters, which are ghastly-looking creatures encountered regularly in the late game. The mutation success rate was between 15 and 20%, which isn't great, but his army grew, and as his army grew, so did the number of captives they were able to bring to the base to be mutated. After the Master moved to the Los Angeles Vault and integrated with the systems there, similar to how he did in the Mariposa military base, he began a new series of experiments. Once again, using unwilling participants, these experiments targeted specific areas of the brain, injecting concentrated FEV straight into it. These experiments yielded very strange and up to this point, novel and interesting results. Some of these individuals who survived these horrific treatments went on to become some of the first psychers we see in the series, which are individuals with various psychic powers. All of the psychers are insane to varying degrees, and there are electrokinetic, photokinetic, telekinetic, and pyrokinetic psychers. Psychers are an interesting topic and deserve their own video, but it is just important to know that psychers in this instance came as the result of FEV experimentation. The Master, now a large amalgamation with several people and machines, would have his plan become unraveled when it was revealed to him that super mutants were not able to reproduce naturally. When Richard Gray fell into the vats at Mariposa in 2102, one of his friends that followed him into the base went on to become a well-known Fallout character known as Harold, who was exposed to the virus while in the base but was not dipped like Richard was. Being hit by the same robotic arm that knocked Richard into the vats, Harold woke up outside and started to undergo a very strange mutation. Harold, by all appearances, seemed to ghoulify, except he began to grow a tree in his head that he affectionately refers to as Bob. This tree would continue to grow until at least 2277, when the events of Fallout 3 unfold, and he is found having traveled across the United States, firmly planting himself in the capital wasteland, as the little sapling that grew out of his head went on to encase his entire body and make him immobile. What Harold is exactly is not entirely known, but given his appearance, it may be reasonable to assume that he is a ghoul with unique mutations from FEV. He has a connection with the tree that he is bonded with, although it is not confirmed whether this is a real neural link that he shares, or whether it is an imagined relationship from an old and lonely ghoul that has been through a lot throughout the decades.
The next portion has spoilers for the Fallout 76 Steel Rain Update main storyline. If you do not wish to have this spoiled, pause and navigate to the timestamp in the description.
Back in Appalachia, after the failed events of the Enclave to raise the DEFCON level high enough to gain access to the nuclear arsenal of the area, there came another individual known as Edgar Blackburn, who used his obsession with FEV to make himself do terrible things. A tale as old as time. Edgar had worked as a West Tech researcher before the war that had a particular interest in diseases that afflicted people of Appalachia, who, in his opinion, relied too much on folk remedies rather than hard medicine. Blackburn started working again with scientists that he had known prior to the Great War, and they all focused their attention on FEV, and in order to secure a steady supply of test subjects, worked a deal with a group known as the Hellcat Company, who funneled captured humans to the researchers.
These experiments occurred in Vault 96 and a secret underground portion of the West Tech facility near Huntersville. Vault 96 was a genetic research vault that had the space and equipment for them to carry out testing variations of FEV.
This became a new source of super mutants, which, like always, became a major threat to the people trying to resettle Appalachia, now that the Scorch Beasts and the Scorched Plague were no longer a threat. The newly arrived Brotherhood of Steel struck out to find the source of the mutants in order to end the threat, only to discover that Blackburn was largely responsible for their creation. Although Blackburn was captured by the Brotherhood, he informs them he has several allies carrying out the FEV experimentations, and that the super mutant creation will not stop soon.
The Brotherhood of Steel escort Blackburn to the West Tech facility, which is the genesis point of the new generation of mutants, where he is able to escape and rejoin his fellow researchers. Blackburn then subjects himself to his unique strain of FEV that was probably his so-called 123D serum, or something close to it. After exposure to a gaseous form of FEV and arcs of electricity, Blackburn turns into some kind of super mutant behemoth, which forces the Brotherhood to engage him to end the super mutant threat once and for all.
Jumping forward many years, in 2178, an absolutely pivotal moment happened in the remains of the great city of Boston. The Institute, more specifically an individual known as Dr. Frederick, came into possession of FEV samples from an unknown source and received approval for research. Project Synthesis began in earnest, and the Institute would take wastelanders from the surface, as well as some members from the Institute who did not display scientific aptitude, who had committed very light offenses, like in the case of Edgar Swan, the janitor. Being charged with stealing a cigarette box, he was forced into the program and experimented on. The initial goals of the FEV research program are not well understood, although it does seem that synthetic organics were an early goal. Many subjects died from FEV exposure, while those that survived were observed over a period of time and eventually tagged and discarded on the surface. The main method of infection seems to be by dipping, that is to say, submerging test subjects in large see-through vats. In just 2 years' time, enough super mutants had been created and discarded that the Minutemen were forced to fend off a large force of super mutants from attacking Diamond City, which they successfully held against this new enemy. Years would go by at the Institute, and very little progress would be made, although researchers would come to the conclusion that radiation exposure had an effect on test subjects' response to FEV, and it appeared that the more successful specimens also had less radiation exposure, like some of the subjects from the Institute itself. The Institute was unable to make progress with their strains of FEV, as super mutants are still disappointingly unintelligent and impulsive, and at some point between 2180 and 2227, the Institute officially focuses all FEV research on creating synthetic organics, jump-starting the Generation 3 Synth project. With Sean being kidnapped in 2227 and his DNA being the basis for all Gen 3 synths, the Institute's main focus was on the synth project, but they still seemed to move forward with some of their old FEV experiments that continued to pump out super mutants to the surface. In 2286, Brian Virgil became the lead FEV researcher and began to chafe at the continued commands from Institute leadership to continue the path of testing they had been doing for over 100 years. This eventually led to Brian Virgil lodging complaints and eventually feeling that he had no other choice than to destroy the lab and escape the Institute. Virgil injected himself with a strain of FEV developed in the lab to help enable him to live in the glowing sea and deal with the increased radiation of the area while he hid from the Institute. This strain of FEV is interesting because it has an antidote that is able to retroactively restore Virgil to his human form. However, this antidote is limited to himself only, indicating that he was using his own DNA in some of the FEV research. As mentioned earlier, FEV was key in making synthetic organics an attainable goal by the Institute, but how exactly remains a mystery. Using DNA from a source that had not experienced any damage from radiation, aka Sean, and FEV strains from their years of research, they were finally able to create the basis for Generation 3 synths. We know that all Gen 3s share the same DNA basis, as Sean is both the father of the Institute and father of all Gen 3s in a genetic sense, but we don't know exactly how FEV factored into the research. All we do know is that there seems to be a heavily modified form of the FEV virus specifically for creating synthetic organics. Back on the West Coast, late in the year of 2236, the Enclave became keenly interested in the secrets of the now destroyed Mariposa military base. Gathering a large group of slaves, they forced them to excavate the ruins, removing tons of rock that collapsed when the Vault Dweller caused the base to self-destruct around the year 2161. These slaves would become infected with FEV that was released as they excavated deeper into the base, causing a range of mutations and leading the Enclave to start calling them mutants. Although, if we're being honest, they were probably already calling them that anyway. Around this time, Frank Horrigan would also become infected with FEV and subsequently sent back to the oil platform to be studied. When excavations were done in 2237 and the Enclave had extracted pure samples of FEV, the Enclave sought to kill the slaves, but instead demolished the entrance again to seal them in when they started fighting back. We don't know the extent of the mutations that the workers underwent, but Melchior was one of the slaves that was locked into the base, and when we encounter him in-game, he looks just like every other super mutant, even though from what we can tell, he was never dipped. Frank Horrigan would also go on to become some sort of mutant, although he did not become a classic super mutant. It is hard to know if this is because of the study and research that was done on him by the Enclave after he was infected, or if this is just how his body responded to the FEV. With the FEV samples in hand, the Enclave set to work to conduct research on FEV2 to increase lethality, as well as apply FEV to a project geared towards making Deathclaws even more lethal. The Deathclaw project used targeted FEV injections into Deathclaw brains, similar to how the Master experimented with Psychers. This led to increased intelligence in the Deathclaws that led to them becoming fully self-aware and human-like in intelligence. They were deployed to Vault 13, where they created a relatively peaceful society, and some had distinct characteristics like gray skin and differently shaped tails. Almost all intelligent Deathclaws were wiped out, however, by Frank Horrigan and his task group, effectively ending any chance of the intelligent Deathclaws to become a sizable group. Under the direction of Lieutenant Colonel Charles Curling, Enclave researchers were able to increase the lethality of the virus by orders of magnitude, and also allow for effective air transmission. The capabilities of the new strain called Curling 13 was tested on the village of Arroyo, where the Chosen One came from, and an aerosol concentration of 0.0001% killed most of the villagers in under an hour. Research showed that those with radiation exposure tended to die quicker, meaning for that the first time ever, it was beneficial to be irradiated when exposed to this FEV. Those without prior radiation exposure suffered longer before their bodies succumbed to the subdermal hemorrhaging and convulsions for up to 14 hours. The Enclave's plan was to release this aerosolized form of FEV into the air, where air currents would help it infect all humans and human-based mutated creatures, as it was engineered to only affect cells with human glycoproteins. According to Enclave calculations, global saturation would apparently only take 2 weeks, which seems like an awfully optimistic projection to me. This is not a suicide mission, however, since the Enclave engineered a vaccine that could be aerosolized as well and dispersed within Control Station Enclave, inoculating the entirety of the Enclave forces on the oil rig. But apparently Enclave groups elsewhere would not survive. This was of course stopped by the Chosen One at the end of Fallout 2. That is not the end of the Curling strain, however, since the Enclave around 2277 used another variant of Curling 13 to create the strain that was meant to be inserted into Project Purity in the events of Fallout 3, with basically the same effect. A massive genocide of all mutated humans and human-based mutated creatures was once again the aim, just transmitted through water this time, of which clean water is in short supply. Although this was not as lethal as the original Curling 13, it also did not need a vaccine, as all individuals that did not have radiation damaged DNA and the subsequent mutations from that would not be affected, which includes groups like those born in vaults and the Enclave as well. It is up to the lone wanderer in Fallout 3 as to whether the Enclave succeed in their plans or not. But it is worth noting that both President Dick Richardson, the president of the Californian Enclave, and Colonel Autumn over in the Capital Wasteland did not like the idea of wiping out all mutated humans. However, they were either too married to Enclave ideology to stop it, or lacked the control needed to fully commit to a different plan. That is a lot of history, due in large part to the incredibly important place FEV has in the Fallout franchise. So in the effort to continue to understand and unravel the secrets of FEV, let's talk about the known attributes of the FEV virus. The most detailed information is about the FEV2 strain, since the best sources come from Fallout and Fallout 2. Zax 1.2 from the West Tech facility tells the player many in-depth details about FEV that can clue us into what kind of virus it is. FEV is a megavirus, which is a genus of viruses that at this moment only has one species, and is so named because of the very large size of the virus. Until the discovery of so-called Pandora viruses, which, if that's not a band name, it needs to be, megaviruses were the largest of any observed virus. At a capsid diameter of around 440 nanometers, it is bigger than some varieties of bacteria. The megavirus also has one of the largest genomes in the entire virus world, so it's a pretty good pick for FEV because megaviruses have ample space to store all that DNA. The FEV megavirus is protected by a protein sheath made of ionized hydrogen that is supposed to protect the virus from incoming neutrons, thereby protecting it from radiation. This is a very interesting aspect of the virus and worth keeping in mind, that the virus itself is supposed to not be affected by the damaging effects of radiation. Zax mentions that the sheath protects the viral DNA from incoming neutrons, which is problematic on multiple levels. The first is that ionized hydrogen would not readily absorb or deflect a neutron. Rather, it would very readily accept 1 or 2 electrons, since a hydrogen ion is 1 proton and 1 neutron. Secondly, neutrons themselves are not radioactive, so shielding against them would be a useless endeavor. Ionizing radiation in the form of electromagnetic radiation like ultraviolet, X-rays, and gamma rays would not be stopped by hydrogen ions, but it could conceivably protect against beta or alpha radiation. The hydrogen ions may capture incoming beta particles in the case of electrons, and if the so-called sheath is thick enough, it would block alpha particles, which are essentially helium nuclei. An FEV research holodisk that can be recovered from the West Tech facility that houses Zax notes that FEV uses DNA with a quad helix structure, and this structure was believed by the leader, Major Barnett, to be the next step in human evolution. It is quite interesting to note that quad helix DNA has been found in the human body, and in fact, a Cambridge study found that these structures, known as quadruplexes, play a role in cell division. Suppressing the formation of quadruplexes was found to slow cell division, which the researchers thought had application when it came to cancer treatments. But as a Fallout researcher, I think this makes a lot of sense with the rapid growth and extreme size and muscle density found with super mutants. In fact, this might even make more sense when considering super mutant behemoths who reach sizes and proportions that are almost unrivaled among wasteland creatures. Zax mentions that the virus is a shift-absorptive virus, which I believe is referring to antigenetic shift, which is a process where 2 different strains of different viruses can combine and make a unique mixture of the 2 original viruses. The classic example of this ability is influenza, which is why it is so easy for strains that infect specific animals like birds or pigs to gain the ability to infect humans. This ability may be a reference to another statement by Zax that mentions that the virus is partially reliant on the specimen's DNA, which is assimilated into the FEV DNA, which has so-called recursive code. This FEV-specific DNA has been engineered to identify what it perceives as perfect DNA, that is to say, DNA without damage or mutations. But this can be kind of problematic considering who's decide what perfect DNA actually is. One also has to wonder what other animals and creatures could be infected with FEV, since the engineers no doubt built the virus with human DNA sequences in mind. but maybe this could also include other species, especially since early FEV tests were done on many kinds of animals. So when we look at how exactly FEV works, when FEV infects a cell, it has a certain amount of information as to how the DNA should be according to how it was engineered by researchers. It copies the DNA from the infected cells, mixing that DNA with its own, and any perceived mistakes or mutations are changed. This new mixed and purified DNA is then re-injected into the host cell and causes the host cell to regenerate this new DNA, thereby changing the cell.
The Alpha Experiment holodisc that can be found at the Glow gives specific information as to how the virus infects the cell. It is said to penetrate the cell membrane and attach directly to the host DNA, meaning that FEV would be considered an enveloped virus, which enters the cell by fusing with the cell membrane and passing through. Mitosis occurs immediately, and the entire mitotic cycle lasts 2 hours, although they note that the phenotypical expression, or how the organism looks, will take days or weeks to manifest, which one of the Fallout 1 endings seems to contradict.
How FEV is transmitted is very important because it makes the difference between a very transmissible virus and one that would have difficulty spreading. FEV2 is said by Zax to not be air transmissible and only transmitted via injection or direct contact with the sample, which FEV2 is only shown in game as being a liquid. This is not a fixed attribute of the virus, however, since the Curling 13 strain is a highly lethal airborne virus, and the so-called EEP strain used in Vault 87 was also administered via some sort of gas. FEV2 is not airborne transmissible, which I think it's important to clarify that airborne transmission is recognized as the transmission of pathogens via droplets through the air. We do see, however, that with enough engineering, the virus does have the ability to be air transmissible, which causes lore conflicts that I want to discuss in the speculative part of this video. The virus was originally intended to be used on humans, but in-game lore does show us that it can infect a number of creatures, as shown by the Master's early experiments at Mariposa. Centaurs from Fallout and Fallout 2 have parts from other animals, including a prominent dog head, showing that FEV can apparently infect dogs, and truly shows how dynamic this virus really is. In addition to the centaurs proving that dogs can be infected by FEV, the mutant hounds from Fallout 4 and 76 also attest to this as well. Infected flatworms that may have been part of the early FEV studies turned into floaters that can be seen on the west coast in certain areas as well as Appalachia. According to the Fallout Bible, which may or may not be canon but is still cool as heck, rad scorpions, rats, mantises, geckos, Brahmin, ants, and Venus flytraps are all examples of animals that mutated a certain degree from FEV, although we don't know how much mutation can be attributed solely to FEV since the radiation that blankets the world also causes mutations to occur. This is actually an important point that will be looked at a bit later. So the very last aspect of FEV we have not examined in detail are the effects of FEV, which vary between who is being infected, the method of infection, and what strain they are infected with. The whole point of FEV development was to accentuate good qualities, more specifically strength, endurance, and intelligence. The first strain of FEV that was used on test animals had mixed results, often increasing muscle mass and in some cases intelligence, with the side effect of increased aggression. A great early example of what may be considered FEV1, although it is never called that in the lore, is the albino mole rat of Fallout 2 that can be found in Gecko. Known as Brain, this was a specimen that had been experimented on in the pre-war and exposed to a vat of FEV, after which he mutated into an abnormally large and highly intelligent mole rat with the ability to speak to the Chosen One and lead an entire cult of ghouls. His so-called brother that also escaped similarly grew larger than normal but did not share the high intelligence, instead becoming hyper-aggressive. That said, the effects of FEV are far from assured, and there are any number of mutations and outcomes that can occur due to the nature of the virus to incorporate the host's DNA, which introduces a lot of variability. Due to this, direct exposure with FEV more often than not results in horribly disfigured and misshapen biomasses that do not live long. Those that do end up surviving have a high chance of becoming largely amorphous, and multiple organisms can be combined together into complete abominations. Such examples include centaurs, the Master himself, and the master's early experiments. These biological amalgamations can work together, and in the case of the master, multiple conscious entities can coexist all within one body. This interconnectedness does not only apply to biological entities, as the master was able to interface directly with computers and electronics, which shows the incredible versatility that the virus can have. The most well-known result of direct FEV exposure for all strains except the curling 13 and modified curling, which were meant to kill all mutants, is the creation of supermutants. First created in Appalachia in the Huntersville experiments, common attributes between all supermutant strains include sterility, hairlessness, skin pigment alteration, increased size, increased aggression, and resistance to radiation. The strain used by the Enclave and West Tech facility in West Virginia is very similar to the strain used by the Institute in Fallout 4, because the supermutants have the same darker skin pigment, are in almost every instance less intelligent than normal humans, are hyper-aggressive, and have the chance to produce supermutant behemoths. This may indicate where the Institute got their sample of FEV, although Appalachia is pretty far to travel when we know that there are closer sources of FEV, like at Vault 87 in the Capital Wasteland.
The unique strains developed by Blackburn in Appalachia are unique since they are able to cause near-instant explosive growth, seen when Blackburn transforms into a behemoth. This strain also does not cause green or yellow skin, with the skin being closer to the original pigment. Lastly, it causes some changes not seen in other strains, such as exposed bone, like on the knuckles, which no doubt help make hits and punches more damaging. Blackburn also seemed to retain his faculties, although the short duration of the fight doesn't really showcase his intellectual prowess.
The Vault 87 strain known as EEP shares similarities with the Institute strain and Appalachian strain in that the supermutants are large, aggressive, can create behemoths, remove all sexual characteristics, and with few exceptions, are not very intelligent. There are two significant differences, however. One is that the skin hue of the EEP strain is more of a yellow-green than that of the Institute or Appalachia. And second, we know the virus is transmitted via liquid, either through immersion in the case of the Institute, or ingestion in the case of Appalachia. Vault 87, on the other hand, is transmitted via a concentrated gas, which may indicate that the Institute did not get their FEV samples from Vault 87. FEV2, which is the strain used on the West Coast with the Master, could result in very intelligent supermutants, as is shown by his right-hand man, Lieutenant, or Marcus from Fallout 2 and New Vegas. FEV2 does not seem to have the constant growth associated with East Coast strains. No behemoths are produced. Their skin is also darker green, similar to the Institute and Appalachia strains, and Nightkin seem to only be associated with supermutants infected with FEV2, as they are absent everywhere else. Outside of the supermutants, targeted injections of FEV2 into human brains produce psychers, which may not be the only way psychers are created, as evidenced by other psychers in the game that were not exposed to FEV, like the Forecaster in New Vegas, but FEV does apparently have this capability. The Institute and Appalachian strains are also unique in the creation of mutant hounds, whereas dogs are usually only seen in centaurs, fused with other creatures, when exposed to the FEV2 strain. The Curling 13 strain has been changed drastically to not share any effects with the normal FEV2, rather has been changed to be air transmissible, be extremely lethal at low concentrations, and to only target humans and humanoid creatures, leaving all other forms of life unharmed. It was successfully used on the village in Arroyo, where it proved its lethality and caused hemorrhaging, inflammation, and organ failure. The modified curling strain used by President Eden was changed to be transmitted through the water rather than the air, and instead of targeting all humans and human-based creatures, it targets only those that have mutations, making it more refined. It is still lethal. However, the lethality is not at the level of the original Curling 13 strain, as the lone wanderer can drink several bottles of infected water before dying, which is a far cry from a 0.0001 concentration of Curling 13 being completely lethal. Lastly, the Institute strain for Synth generation is the one we know least about, and has a completely different use compared to all other strains. It is difficult to even provide conjecture as to how it works, but we know using Sean's DNA and FEV, the Institute was able to grow organics, as seen in the synth production room in the Institute. Additionally, the amount of exposure for FEV2 and perhaps other supermutant producing strains makes a very large difference as well. Dipping a subject directly into the viral liquid was the best way to consistently create supermutants. Other methods that did not introduce as much virus had different effects that may or may not result in becoming a supermutant. Harold is a great example of this, as Richard Gray was fully dipped and even floated in the vats for some time, becoming an amorphous being that we also see with creatures like centaurs. Harold, on the other hand, did not fall into a vat like Richard, and had much less exposure, which led to his unusual ghoul-like tree symbiotic condition. That brings us to the one confounding factor that consistently affects the end result of FEV infection: radiation. Radiation has been identified independently multiple times in the series, from the Institute, to the Master, to the Enclave, and each time, complications for the group's desired goals. With FEV2, radiation will cause the supermutants to lack the intelligence required by the Master to reach his ultimate goal of a unity, and drives the Master to seek out vaults and other populations that have been protected from radiation. The Institute identified radiation as being a key issue to developing the synthetic organics, which led them to seeking out vaults, and specifically any babies or young children in these vaults. Vault 111 ended up being perfect for them, since Sean was a pre-war child that had been frozen and therefore the least likely of any option to have radiation damage. Finally getting Sean's DNA was the missing ingredient to finally unlocking the secrets to synthetic organics that led to successful Generation 3 synths. But it took the Institute decades to develop two promising strains and identify the issue of radiation damage. Even the Curling 13 strain was affected by radiation, causing any unfortunate soul infected with it to actually succumb to the virus quicker if they have radiation damage, which honestly is a small mercy in that situation. So that is the history, characteristics, and effects of all strains of FEV. Let's examine the implications of this lore. The topic of radiation serves as a great segue to an interesting discussion within Fallout. So we know that there is conflicting interaction between the effects of radiation and those of FEV, but this interaction was a source of some contention among the original developers of Fallout. It is fairly widely known that Tim Kaine wished to attribute mutations in the wasteland solely on radiation, which would make sense with names like rad scorpions. Chris Taylor, on the other hand, wanted these mutations and mutated creatures to be a result of a mixture of FEV and radiation. Personally, I don't really care either way, and I think it might be cool if radiation-induced mutations means that creatures have certain buffs and debuffs that make the player consider using certain weapons or tactics to take advantage of them. FEV would be the same way, and so in this kind of scenario, we would have animals that owe all their mutations to radiation, animals with a radiation FEV mix, and other animals that owe all their mutations to FEV. If, just as an example, creatures with FEV mutations were more resistant to radiation damage and ballistic damage, then the player could opt for different weaponry to dispatch the creatures a bit more easily. This would add a level of nuance to the game that for those that wish to play on harder difficulties or survival would need to take into account, while casual players may not even notice much of a difference on easy difficulties. It would also acknowledge this convoluted part of the lore that not even the developers themselves can agree on, which, at the end of the day, aren't we all just looking for some good answers? The easiest way around this would be to just say that FEV did not spread and cause animals to mutate, and that all mutation was the product of radiation, because we know that radiation blanketed every inch of the post-war world. To try and justify FEV spread would be a bit more difficult, because FEV was only located in a few areas, meaning that it could realistically only spread from a few select areas. This point brings me to the next lore issue or contradiction that is worth mentioning, and that is the claim that FEV was dispersed into the atmosphere when the West Tech facility was hit. See, if you've been paying attention, which if you haven't, well, you're free to do whatever you want. You've made it this far into a deep dive of a fictional virus in a video game series where artificial intelligence runs on vacuum tubes, so who am I to judge? As I was saying, earlier it was stated by Zax 1.2, which was an authority on FEV, due to the virus being its primary area of research, that FEV is not transmissible through air. The notion that a bomb that would send hundreds, maybe thousands of gallons of FEV into the atmosphere, where it would percolate down and mildly infect the entire world, rests on the notion that FEV is indeed air transmissible. Connecting back to the previous point, there is just no way that creatures could have had widespread FEV infection without an event like the destruction of West Tech releasing FEV into the air. With no air transmission, FEV would be limited to a very small area around whatever facility that it was housed in. Otherwise, are we expected to believe that a handful of scorpions skittering around the West Tech ruins went on to become rad scorpions and spread across the entire continental United States from essentially a single source? That doesn't really make a lot of sense, and we've been talking about some pretty nonsensical things here. So we have an issue where either the lore has an inconsistency, which is tantamount to sacrilege for many people, or to assume that Zax is mistaken. That last point would cast Zax's reliability into severe doubt, and we'd have to start questioning what else it could be wrong about. It could also possibly show that Zax really isn't as intelligent as it proposes, and that perhaps all along it wasn't a super advanced biotechnology researcher, but just a glorified chess-playing machine, because we do know he's good at that. There are clues, however, that FEV2 has always been air transmissible, since the workers excavating the ruins of Mariposa began to mutate when digging out rubble. Kicking up dust and particulates as they dug through would easily expose all workers to the virus, depending on how long the virus can survive on hard surfaces. Rather than a scenario where liquid FEV had been splattered all over the base, and the workers were happily digging through goo-covered detritus. The last bit of evidence that Zax is indeed wrong about the method of transmission is the fact that Enclave researchers have found low levels of FEV infection in the entire region, and that people seem to have a low level of immunity to the virus. This was from a military holodisc that can be found on the oil rig that gives details into Enclave FEV research. How could the entire region have traces of the virus and all tested populations have low level immunity if it hadn't been spread through the air when the West Tech facility blew up? We would just have to assume some sort of person-to-person transmission from people that were directly exposed to samples of FEV, and that it was able to spread effectively through the entire population this way, which is possible, but I hope you start to see something here. We can either admit that Zax was wrong about the virus, and that the West Tech detonation theory is true, or we have to make a series of justifications and assumptions that may or may not be directly justified in lore. I'm going with the simpler answer here, that Zax was wrong, but until we get some in-game confirmation, we can't say anything definitively. What if the virus had been mutated by radiation and was able to spread differently than the original FEV2 strain? That may explain why the Enclave sees FEV all over the place, and why FEV mutated creatures like rad scorpions can be found on both coasts. But that would mean that Zax is wrong on a different point then. His claim that a specialized protein sheath protects the virus from radiation.
I touched on why the ionized hydrogen sheath protecting from incoming neutrons doesn't make sense on multiple levels. But if FEV did indeed mutate due to radiation, then Zax is once again giving us bad information. Now, some people may argue that the fact that super mutants are immune to radiation means that FEV is also immune, but that is not the case. The alpha experiment disk tells us that once the subject's DNA has been altered with the new code and the new quadruple helix structure, that it is this structure that somehow is not susceptible to mutation from radiation. The virus does not seem to persist in the body. Rather, it is this hyperstable form of DNA that works so well that the organism seems like it can live in perpetuity. Quadruplexes in the real world do not appear to have any greater stability or resistance to mutations than normal double helix DNA. The fact that they are mostly found in cancer cells would seem to completely contradict that. If anything, it would make more sense if the virus persisted in the body in some form. And if the virus really was resistant to radiation, DNA could be constantly updated by reinfection, but that would only work if the virus is resistant to radiation, which lore appears to disprove.
A final point that I find interesting is a disagreement between the Master and Lieutenant, as to why some people mutate into undesirable mutants who have low intelligence. The Master has come to the conclusion that radiation is the cause, having done damage to those exposed and complicating the FEV transformation process. This would make sense since the virus uses the original host's DNA in part of its recursive code. So if that DNA is damaged enough, it would follow that it would cause complications. On the other side, the Lieutenant believes that widespread low-level immunity is keeping the virus from infecting to the level that it should, since the body would be able to mount at least a partially successful defense of the virus due to prior exposure. We know that this exposure exists because the Enclave did research and found that all the regions and tested populations had traces of FEV. Radiation has been identified by more than just the Master as a confounding variable with FEV infection. However, who's to say that they both aren't right? Lou has some issues with trustworthiness since he withheld knowledge of supermutant sterility from the Master, but we know there is widespread FEV infection, and such a thing definitely could have an impact on successful supermutant creation. So maybe we should give Lou a break, because he certainly could be right about his assertion, and radiation damage alone, or coupled with FEV immunity, could both cause issues. One quick note about the Master is that I think he was too quick to give up on his entire plan. The supermutants themselves may not have been able to reproduce naturally. However, we know from the Enclave research into death claws, where injections in the brain that cause them to be intelligent had zero effect on their fertility. Similarly, the Master was experimenting with these psychers, and even though all the psychers themselves were a little bit crazy, the Master's early experiments with FEV were also really problematic. He was not making super mutants right out the gate. So really I feel like the Master, rather than deciding that his whole plan was foiled, should have just completely refocused on his psyker research, since that was showing some real promise as to very unique abilities, and they would also be able to reproduce naturally. Congratulations on making it this far. It is no small feat to listen about FEV for 50 minutes, but there is still more video left. I don't have anything left to say about FEV, at least not until I start to read some of your comments on this video, but I have the comment highlights as well as a bit of news. I have started a Patreon for those of you that aren't content with just liking, subscribing, and commenting, and this is due in large part to YouTube starting to age restrict some of my videos. Apparently, unedited footage of Fallout 3 is too graphic for the sweet, innocent minds of teenagers everywhere, and I must have made a few friends in whatever YouTube drone factory makes these decisions. Support from you through Patreon ensures that I can make videos going over things like the chems or the weapons of Fallout, and not have to worry about it getting age restricted. I also want to give back some perks for those of you who want to help build Adam's kingdom in this way, by giving access to a Patreon-only channel on Discord, channel shoutouts, as well as getting videos a day early. I'll be cooking up some more behind the scenes, but just $1 or a few dollars a month would ensure I can cover any and all Fallout related content, no matter how much it hurts YouTube's fees. So let's get to some comments from my Spirits and Cocktails of Fallout video. Alright guys, first things first, and I don't know how to say this, I messed up. Since I couldn't get something as basic as a first name right, it looks like this will be my last video. Remember me fondly. Although, not too fondly, let's not make things weird. In all seriousness, mistaking Vadim's last name as his first name, Bobrov, was a bad mistake on my part that only 100 of you corrected me on. It's always the things you think you know well enough that you never double check that come to bite you in the butt. You know what I mean? Laughing Pug made a good point about the mountain honey. It is most likely a mead based on the ingredients, which is essentially just water and honey. Several of you commented on absinthe and why it has a buff to perception. Most mentioned a chemical called thujone, which is thought to have hallucinogenic properties, and a couple others mentioned copper salts that might have had the same effect that were added to help make it green in some cases. At any rate, it is commonly understood that excessive consumption would lead to hallucinations, which depending on how you view things could either increase perception, since you are seeing more things than ever before, or decrease perception because you're seeing things that aren't even there. A few of you mentioned that the punga fruit in Fallout 3 will decrease rads upon consumption, so its inclusion in the moonshine in Point Lookout could be the reason why the moonshine does not dose the player with rads, and I think that is a great explanation. A few of you also let me know that there was an additional moonshine added in Fallout 76 in the newest update called the Mire Magic Moonshine. It can be obtained from the Moonshine Jamboree event, doses for 45 rads, debuffs intelligence and charisma by 1 but adds 2 to strength, and 50% more damage when using the Gulper Smacker, which is a Fallout 76 weapon that is just an ore, which is kind of hilarious. Fermenting it will double the buffs and debuffs, so it's definitely worth the wait to ferment. Ciara Fox made a good point in reference to the tick blood tequila, since sangria, a Spanish and Portuguese wine's name, literally means bloodletting, and would be perfectly appropriate for a drink made from real blood. I also don't get the fascination with tick blood in Fallout 76, because there are more than a few consumables that use it. You made it to the end of this video, but as always, take strength in Adam's word, and let it hold you over until the next sermon. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you soon.